Thanks for doing this. Let me just say a word about our other panelists here. Jay Craven, who's at my far left, teaches film and video at Marlborough College. Jay splits his time between Marlborough and the Northeast Kingdom, where he has to get back to tonight. He's a well-known and highly respected filmmaker whose films include High Water, Where the Rivers Flow North, A Stranger in the Kingdom, The Year That Trembled, and Disappearances, among many others. Thanks for being here, Jay. John Sheehy teaches writing and literature at Marlborough. John grew up in Montana, and I understand has a particular interest in the identity of the American West. He earned degrees from Montana State and the University of Washington, and taught writing at University of Washington before coming to Marlborough. And the other person who's here is John Willis. He's also a faculty member at Marlborough College. John's a photographer, and he has for years worked on Pine Ridge Sioux Reservation. And Carol Hendrickson is an anthropologist whose area of specialty, or one of them I should say, is weaving in the Central Highlands of Guatemala. Carol's an expert on Mayan dress. Carol's also an accomplished and creative journaler, not a journalist, but a journaler. And a selection of Carol's travel journals are going to be on display here beginning in just a few weeks as part of an exhibit of travel journals by 3 women from our area. So thank you all so much for being here. And as I mentioned to you all beforehand, there's no real agenda. I think you all have such interesting backgrounds and areas of expertise that pertain to some of the issues raised here in the film. So maybe we can just go down and hear briefly from each of you, what strikes you, what you'd like to say, and then we can open it up for questions. Want to start here, Carol?
Sure. I guess because of being an anthropologist, I think more of the documentaries. I'm more familiar with the documentaries, and it would be very interesting to have a kind of parallel history of documentaries. As I mentioned at the end of this film, more and more cameras are being put into the hands of Native Americans, and by that I mean people in Canada and the U.S., as we saw here, but also in Mexico, Guatemala, down to Brazil, down south into South America. And some important work is being done that way. The cameras used to speak out against issues, to hold their own position against governments and other kinds of activities within the countries. And I think it's partly because of the expense of making feature-length films that perhaps we don't see Native American films as much in countries which are not as wealthy as the United States and Canada. So, yes, I'll stop there.
I'll just start off by saying you should come see Carol's journals in the upcoming show because they're fantastic. But I guess the thing that crossed my mind the most at first when talking with Danny about being on this panel or looking at the show and giving feedback, and also with talking with the others here, is how strange it is for non-Native people to be representing and talking about the representation of Native people. It just seemed incongruous, and why don't we have a panel of people who are all Native people? That said, they didn't have people in mind, and it's not that I believe we wouldn't have things that we could think about and all talk about and say, because obviously it's best in many ways for people who are living a life to be able to talk about their own life and not people from the outside to talk about it. And people from the outside talking about other people's experience often get it wrong, and that's a large part of what was going on in this film that they're bringing up, is how much in Hollywood they were representing people in a way that wasn't really right or fair or not the best thing to do. But I'm a photographer. I do documentary work. I look at a lot of documentary work and appreciate documentary work. I see a lot of problems with all of us who go out in the world and make work about the other, but at the same time wonder, is there value in still doing it, and how can we do it in a way that makes sense? And part of it is trying to just be conscious to the fact of that as a non-Native person or somebody looking at the other, we come from a privileged background, a place of privilege that maybe isn't really right or fair, and we don't really understand people's perspectives other than ourselves. And we look through a lens through our experience, our awareness, and the way that we were brought up and the opportunities we've had in life. So it's really hard to sit and look at somebody else's life who has really lived differently. And maybe one thing that we can talk about now, or at least I feel I can talk about, is just how important it is to become aware of the fact that when I go into somebody else's community, when I talk with somebody else about their life or try and represent them, that I am doing it through my experience and the lens that I see, not through theirs. And if I, as an image maker or as a viewer, become more conscious, hopefully that's helpful. I also am thrilled to see more contemporary work that's coming out by indigenous people all over in all forms of visual and personal expression. I think it's great, but it still makes me wonder all the time whether or not there's a place for us to look at and make work about people other than ourselves. And I guess I'm somebody who still believes there's a need for it, but there's a need for us to really change and try and be much more conscious about how we do it.
Well, I have already expressed to these guys, I share John's reservations about some of this. There was a little snippet from Smoke Signals early in the film where one character says to two other characters, the only thing funnier than seeing Indians on TV is seeing Indians watch Indians on TV. And probably the only thing funnier than that is to see a group of white people talking about Indians on TV. So this is a somewhat weird thing for us to be doing, but I grew up about 60 miles from Little Bighorn, and I grew up in Montana, very close to a lot of Indian reservations and very conscious in a certain way of living on Indian land. And for most of my life, as I've studied American literature and developed a particular interest in the Western and in Native American literature, I've become more and more fascinated about how our narrative about the conquest of North America is actually largely a narrative about ourselves. It is a narrative about white America and what we want to think about ourselves and how we want to understand our history. So, like, one of the things that I would point out looking at all these films, like I've watched a lot of Westerns. One of the things that's remarkable about Westerns, first of all, is that they're more or less ubiquitous. They're pretty much, from the time there were films, there were Westerns. We often refer to Westerns as being about cowboys and Indians, but in fact, probably more than half of the Westerns ever made didn't have Indians in them at all, didn't have Indians in them as characters or as part of the narrative. But more often we're like, I don't know if you've seen the film Shane, it's another iconic Western. Shane is about, it's sort of a classic model of a Western. It's farmers, homesteaders moving in to push out cattle ranchers from the open range. There are no native people at all in Shane, but if you listen to the things that the cattle ranchers say as they're being pushed off the open range, the cattle ranchers are actually putting themselves in the role of the Indians who are not there. And so in fact, the narrative of the vanished people, the narrative of sort of history pushing people off the map and making people disappear has been sort of taken out of the context of the initial conquest of North America and instead just turned into a narrative about white America and progress and modernity. So one of the things that I note about Westerns as a sort of fictional motif, and in a lot of ways they have been the dominant fictional motif in the 20th century in America in various ways. They are almost always about natives versus non-natives. But one of the important metaphorical constructions for Americans has been to place ourselves in the role of the Indians that we have just erased. And that's a very ambivalent, strange gesture, but you see it everywhere. There's a long history, really starting back before the Revolutionary War, of Americans, white Americans, dressing as Indians. Probably the most important version of that is the Boston Tea Party. So it's really a deep part of the American experience, as myth as well as reality.
Thanks, John.
As a filmmaker, I mean, most of my movies have been made based on Vermont stories, and I have worked to include Native actors in all my films because partly the idea for me of Native people as just Americans or New Englanders or Vermonters has been interesting to me, and so. And this sometimes is a challenge working with the actors because they're used to playing Indians. You know, they sometimes find themselves playing type, you know, around that. I worked with Tantu Cardinal in Where the Rivers Flow North, and again in a TV series I did called Windy Acres. And Windy Acres particularly, I mean, the only work she'd been getting for, you know, about 5 years was small parts to play the Indian. And so we actually sort of went through a bit of a struggle around, I want you to play this Vermont character, and she'd played, I felt, pretty successfully Vermont character in Where the Rivers Flow North. But so I think that for me, the notion of Native people are also Americans, and they exist in any number of places. And in northern Vermont, you see Native people and French Canadian people whose families have sort of, you know, intermingled over the years, and you have a sort of a unique sort of northern New England culture that is informed by Native, you know, heritage. And so, as an American independent filmmaker, as a regional filmmaker, which is a status that is often sort of marginalized and looked down upon, you know, the idea that you would be regional and not national. You know, not that the films haven't played nationally, they do, but the primary commitment is always to work with regional stories, regional characterizations. You know, I've sort of come to the belief that the only truly independent, sustainable film movement that could possibly exist in America would have to be regional. And that as a result, in the regions, you would begin to look to integrate cultural elements, including Native culture. And so, in my own way, I sort of try to do that. It has its challenges all the time, but you can't look at a northern New England history or culture without including what some of its Native influences are, including during times when Native people were largely assimilated and were not sort of culturally identified in a primary way as Native people. They were simply, you know, loggers or people, you know, working in menial jobs, or people, you know, in the case of Where the Rivers Flow North, you know, a housekeeper, which was sort of an old concept of sort of a live-in relationship that was truthful to these old logging camps and these places. And the character of Bangor was actually based on a real character who was from largely Native stock, you know, but never identified herself in a primary way as an Indian. And so for me, that is sort of what's been fascinating, is to work with questions of assimilation and identity. And, you know, I produced last summer a play called Only Drunks and Children Tell the Truth by an Ojibwa playwright that is, you know, that deals with these similar issues and sort of the history of being sent to, being adopted. This was a Canadian play, but being adopted, you know, Indian children being taken away and raised by white families. And, you know, there is a sort of social history that I think you begin to approach in looking at how Native people have functioned in contemporary society. Even the film is mostly dealing with mythic Indians and notions around mythic Indians, and also is largely dealing with a national concept of the Indian. And I think that if we did develop more regional cinema, we would, through the experience of it, begin to understand our own history, our own Native you know, culture, how it remains vibrant and how it has struggled and all these different things. So that's sort of what I've tried to do in ways that I can. I've enjoyed working with a lot of different Native actors in particular, but it's always quite illuminating and always interesting too. I mean, I'll just give one small example of how Native people, Native actors, often get dealt with. I mean, in social situations where I've been with Gary Farmer, Taintu Cardinal, Sheila Tousey, some actors that I've worked with, and there's a tendency to always think of them as Indians. And to not realize when you're talking to Gary Farmer that he's, you know, he knows Shakespeare and Eugene O'Neill and he's acted in a wide range of material, but he's always treated as the Indian. And he's a very bright guy, very talented guy, and it's painful to be with him sometimes. I know it's painful to him, but he knows how to deal with it. You know, and these are small, subtle things. Here he is, a bunch of liberal, progressive people, whether in New York or in Vermont or whatever, and it's always that Gary gets dealt with as the Indian. And so part of my deal is to try to break, you know, to make movies where Indians don't have to play Indians. I've got a sort of country film noir right now that I'm trying to make that I'd love to make with an all-Native cast, where none of the characters are written as Native people. I can't get financing for it because as much as we see here in the new rebirth of India, I mean, Chris Eyre, who made Smoke Signals, how many Native directed movies have there been since then? That's the first Native American directed movie ever made in America. Now Canada's different because there are quotas in Canada. There are mandates by the government to ensure Native representation. As a result, there's more of a film industry. But Chris, you know, is doing some television stuff, and there was a great hope in the Native community when Dance of Wolves was made that was a rebirth, a coming of age for Native talent, and then with Black Robe right after that. But it wasn't sustained. And in some ways, I mean, Sundance was a primary champion of Native filmmaking, and it has eliminated its Native program, its sidebar, and it became for a long time contentious and condescended to by the American independent film movement. Oh, that's the ghetto, that's the, you know, everybody knows you don't have to make good films to get into the Native side. But it was really sort of, you could see this kind of cultural prejudices coming out there. I think that the status of Native film remains very insecure and uncertain in terms of how we go forward. Again, I would just look to the regions to begin to develop their own understandings and to work with Native filmmakers. There are not a lot of Native filmmakers and not a lot of Native directors. And so that's just a reality.
I just throw out though that I think that the issues you're talking about, or we're all talking about, they go across the board to anybody who's basically non-white. And I think one way that would really help it is to do anything that we can to support, you know, people who are non-white also being able to make creative work and have an audience, have respect and appreciation and an audience for it.
Absolutely, yeah.
I just want to respond to two things I heard, and then open up for your comments and questions. I'm interested and relieved, Jay, to hear what you're saying about your approach to Indianness or Indian identity in your films, because it seemed kind of conspicuous to me that here in the documentary we just saw, they kind of optimistically chart this progress in how the issue has been dealt with, but still sort of the pinnacle of it here at the end was still a matter of Indians being, you know, portrayed as Indians, and the Indianness of those human beings being central to their depiction, and not that what would seem to me to be the next step or a subsequent step in that evolution, which is where I'm a Jewish actor, but I don't have to be playing a Jewish character every time, or you know.
Sure. And Johnny Depp is an Indian actor, and Fred Ward is an Indian actor. Raquel Welch was, you know, but they didn't want to be cast as Indians. I mean, they knew for career reasons Johnny Depp does not want to be known as an Indian actor. And you know, he has a lot of solidarity with Indian actors, but it's on the side because he knows to succeed he can't get pigeonholed that way.
I also wanted to respond to John and John, and you know, we talked a little bit beforehand. Of course, I totally appreciate this issue and this sort of uncomfortableness, but only if you were really sitting there being sort of spokespeople for a cultural group that you're not part of. But that it's obvious, I mean, with the comments, you know, with the perspective you've shared, that's obviously not what you've brought to the table tonight, not why we invited you to participate, to represent, you know, anyone who you ought not to be representing. I mean, as someone who makes images, as someone who's thought about these issues of cultural identity and has familiar with the American West, I mean, you obviously bring a lot to the discussion. And I'm happy you're here. Do people have comments and any questions? Yeah, Laura.
I was fascinated in the film where humor became extremely important. And that's not uniquely Indian. I mean, I've gotten through tough times in my life through humor as well. But the fact that it was so intrinsically important through the cinema history, I was sort of surprised there wasn't a clip from Blazing Saddles, because you've got the Jew playing the Indian chief with the feathers, you know, total skewering of all of the tropes possible. And I was wondering if our anthropologist on board has found that humor in the groups that you've worked with has also been so intrinsically human, as I would assume it would be, but...
Well, and I guess my sort of one interaction and sort of in the content of this conversation was wondering should I bring it up, but I was involved with a program in Navajo Reservation and was there over a long weekend and actually went out hiking with a group of students who, as we hiked through the Canyonland, began talking about their experiences being hired as extra in Hollywood movies. And they joked as we walked along, and I guess you would say as a way of handling this kind of characterization of bringing Hollywood to their backyard, so to speak, of the opportunity that they then were presented with wearing authentic Indian costumes, which they didn't mean to be authentic, but this was their chance to dress up as the Hollywood Indian, and that was a sort of framework for kind of several miles of talking and discussing their opportunities to play in these films and make some extra money. And one of the jokes was that they got extra money if they were shot as opposed to just riding a horse. And under one occasion it was not specified who was supposed to fall off the horse, so the white guy shot at this group of Indians and 6 or 8 people fell off. To get the extra pay. So anyway, there was a humorous interchange in terms of these memories of playing Indians for Hollywood.
I have to say, I think all people that I've known, all groups of people that are generalizing, use humor in tough times. But I will also say that, you know, spending a lot of time with Lakota people, that they do so more than any group of people I've ever been around. That humor is a big part of their life, and they will really enjoy being with you a lot more if you will spend time making jokes about things, teasing each other. They tease each other all the time, and they love it. It's a major part of life. And I also wanted to comment back to what you were saying, because I do agree with what Jay was saying, what you were saying about, you know, sort of equality and the idea of regional films and all, but I also want to say that over the years I've come to feel like one of the maybe negative things about America is our sort of goal that I was brought up with of having a melting pot, like we're all trying to be equal and one group of people, and that I think we need to work towards equality and respect and appreciation. But I've come to even disdain the whole idea of having more tolerance for people, because I think what we really needed to do is to learn to respect and appreciate different cultures. And a lot of Native people that I know would really want to be identified as Native, but in a way that didn't make them less human or less good or less smart or whatever. It respected who they are. So
I think if it's one element of who you are, one element of your identity that's respected and recognized,
right,
but it's not maybe the paramount
right,
prevailing one.
right. I agree with you. I just wanted to say that because I wouldn't want to ever give the impression that I thought it was worth erasing.
Yeah,
and make
I
us
didn't
look
suggest
like
that.
we're equals.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's actually connected to the point that you were raising. There's a scholar named Vine Deloria, Lakota scholar. Wrote a lot of great books. One of them is called Custard Died for Your Sins, and he opens the book by saying, you know, one of the defining qualities of Native Americans in the larger American culture is that Native Americans always have a plight. That's how white culture represents Native Americans often, as having some plight, some really cross that they're bearing really for the sins of the white culture. There's a literary movement that starts roughly in the 1960s. It's usually referred to as the Native American Renaissance. And the early works in that movement are all really sort of motivated by a response to the just unavoidable tragedy of what's happened here over the last 200 years. But later works in the movement, in particular Sherman Alexie, who wrote the books on which Smoke Signal was based. Sherman Alexie and a lot of contemporary Native American writers are really, really, really funny. And I think the humor is, I think that humor is basically humanizing. It is what we all have in common. It is possible for Sherman Alexie to be funny and to be distinctly who he is, to be Native American, but also to be sort of in control of a persona and representation and in control of irony. So I think that the humor is kind of a political act in a certain way. So it is also just funny. He's just a funny guy.
Jay, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, in trying to extend the conversation, I think if a Native actor is cast in a part that is not necessarily written as Native, that they bring a lot of Native reality, experience, culture to it. And I certainly, in trying to work with Native actors, that's what I, try to do. I mean, when I cast Gary Farmer as a whiskey smuggler in northern Vermont, the first conversation was, that his uncle was a whiskey smuggler across the Canadian border, and he drove a white Cadillac, and he dressed great, and he stayed at the nice hotels. And this goes contrary to what our images are of the Indian. But for Gary, this was a thrilling opportunity to bring all of this very personal history that is Native history, because it's his family, into an unconventional role of a Native, whiskey smuggler driving a Cadillac across the border in northern Vermont. The same was true with Tantu Cardinal, her granny Haydock, who helped raised her when her mother had to go to the city to, work as a chambermaid, and, became the inspiration for her character. I mean, film is a collaborative medium. And I think when you connect with actors as principal collaborators, you're bringing their cultural experience. You're bringing, especially for Native people who are fairly in touch with that, in many cases, as actors. They're getting an opportunity also to do something that they often don't get to do. When Tantu Cardinal played in Dances with Wolves, she got to play the squaw, Dances with Wolves has some interestingly developed Native characters, but it also has a number of stereotypical Native characters that were limited by their sort of needing to be those Indian characters. So that's all I'm saying, is that, Tantu Cardinal could have played Pretty Woman, as far as I'm concerned. And it would have been more interesting, artistically, culturally, and the Indian presence in the characterization would have, illuminated things that, her having to continue to play small parts in Legends of the Fall, where she's basically a servant who says, yes, sir, and no, sir, that doesn't get to happen.
I just wanted to mention too, there's a book called Portraits of the White Men, which is looking at a Western Apache, basically characterizations, but joking characterizations of white people. And it's incredibly clever, pulls in all sorts of observations about social interactions and really nails it a lot.
I had a question. And maybe Jay would be the one to answer this, but Smoke Signals was made in 1998, so 12 years ago. Has Chris Ayres done anything since then? I haven't heard of anything.
He's done mostly cable movies. Did a picture called Skins. There was a brief clip from that. You know, he continues to work. He's done some TV directing. I mean, you know, I know Chris. I've known him for a long time. Because I've been very pleased with the fact the films I've made, the Native American community has embraced. I mean, you know, they appreciate it when white filmmakers work with Native actors and develop characters and, you know, stories. And Chris was making short films for a long time, and Sundance was critically important to his getting to make Smoke Signals. But the idea of Chris continuing to make theatrical feature films, with, you know, based on Native stories, he hasn't really been able to do that. Sherman Alexie, in fact, wanted to direct and really hasn't been able to, you know, move to that point. I mean, there's questions of financing. I mean, Smoke Signals was a very carefully shepherded project. I mean, Redford wanted this to happen very badly, and Miramax agreed to take it on, and there were a whole series of relationships to make sure that that film got made, and I think it's a terrific film, you know. But there wasn't, it's not like it opened up a new possibility. There were a number of Tony Hillerman, right? He's the Native detective stories that were made by PBS, you know, and that was considered a major initiative by PBS. Again, Redford played a role in getting it to happen, blah, blah, blah.
And Adam Beach was in that.
And Adam Beach was in them, and they were not financially successful, and, you know, the PBS system basically vowed never to do it again. I mean, these are the struggles that Native filmmakers are facing, you know, is the lack of commercial viability in an industry that is so commercial. See, the Canadian media industry is not commercial in the same way. So more actually gets done to a certain extent. But, you know, Chris Ayres continues to work, but he does, you know, NYPD episodes, or he'll do, and he does some Native stories specifically through, mostly through Turner. I mean, it was through Turner, although that's getting harder to do too. But I haven't seen him probably in 2 or 3 years. But you know, and the Native community struggles. I mean, there are factions, there are, you know, it's just like anything else. But I'm hoping actually to bring Gary Farmer, a Native actor, here in December. I'm trying to raise $1,000 to make it happen. And Gary was in Smoke Signals, he was in Powwow Highway, he was in Dead Man. He's one of the leading Native American actors. He also has a blues band, and he wants to come up tomorrow and play in his blues band. We'd screen a couple of his movies, and I think he'd be a good person to talk to about all this, because, you know, Gary had to turn down, you know, working for a day as a day player in a Native movie, you know, 2 months ago, because he didn't have $300 to pay the Screen Actors Guild dues, you know. And he's a major actor. He's a terrifically talented actor. It's you know, in the same way that Native people are marginalized financially in so many ways, it's also true within the movie business. But anyway, Chris is the Native American director. He does get some work, but you know, it's difficult.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up at this point. As much as I'm sure I could stay here a lot longer listening to you guys. It's been really interesting. And thank you so much for being willing to come up here. And thanks all of you for coming.
Thank you.
Please come again.
Absolutely.
And have a good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.